Welcome, everyone, to the Lift Your Story podcast with Lorianne and Roy Miller.
Hi, everyone. I am Lorianne. I am that gal from Milton, Ontario, Canada, and I'm with.
I am that guy. I am Roy Miller from Dallas, Texas, and we'd like to welcome you to our Lift Your Story podcast.
So, in this episode, we're very pleased to have Jase with us, and he's the owner of Perfect My Podcast. Thank you so much for being with us today, Jase.
Yeah.
It's great to be here.
Okay, so can you tell us how you got involved in podcasting?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting story. It's not something I set out to do. I wasn't like one day, man, I'm going to be a podcast editor or producer. I started podcasting originally because I was in software sales, and I came out of training for the company that I was in right when COVID shut everything down in 2020. So I was like, great. So I have this new kind of brand around me that I'm representing, and I can't go door knocking. I can't, nobody wants to meet. Nobody wants to even talk about adding anything else to their plate because everybody's business is shutting down. So I'm like, how in the heck am I going to navigate this as a new employee? So that's when I was like, well, let's start a podcast. And honestly, I started the podcast. I didn't know if it would turn into sales or not, but it's like, let's interview local businesses, give some value on what they're doing that's working for their business, and share that with other businesses. And when I found out that podcasting not only gave me credibility in my local area as kind of a business advisor, if you will, but it also gave me ability to network in the community, because it's a lot easier to say, hey, Roy, do you want to be on my podcast, than Roy, do you want to buy my software, as an initial phone call, But once you get in the door, I mean, you can't help but like somebody or have some sort of relationship with somebody after a 30-minute conversation. And then you can take conversations from there. So that was really my start into podcasting. And what I found out through the first 6-8 months of doing this is I liked podcasting a lot more than I liked software sales. And so I was like, well, how do I do more of this? So then that led me into now kind of my main podcast, which is called The Science of Sports Recovery. And I got into that, and I just kind of felt lonely as a podcaster because none of my friends were doing it. In podcasting, you guys probably know this as well, but you kind of record in your office, you edit in your office, you upload in your office, and then you hope the world, kind of listens to it. And then you do it again. And you don't meet a lot of podcasters doing that. So I put out in a few different groups of if I hosted a podcasting network event, real people, real life in a virtual setting, would anybody show up? Because I just wanted to meet other podcasters. And overnight I had 150 people message me or comment yeah, let's get together and that kind of stuff. So I started hosting these podcasting networking events, getting deeper into the community, and found out that I did some things that were I did some things well that other people were struggling with. And then that's when I was like, well, I like podcasting so much, why don't I help other people? And then that was kind of the birth of Perfect My Podcast.
Well, we found out, and you may have as well, that, everybody has a story. No matter who they are, everyone has a story. And we've started out with someone in one area, and next thing you know, we've gone just completely somewhere else that was more interesting than what we started out with.
Yeah.
It's like you're saying, you have a conversation with somebody, and all of a sudden, you're going from point A over here to point X.
Yeah, it's not B, it's X.
Yeah.
It's a good analogy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, actually, when we first started too, it was just Roy and I, and we started thinking, what else are we going to talk about? So it was easier to get other people, to come on and share their stories. So it's been fun. I have a question though. You were saying that some people, you're good at what other people will struggle at. Do you have any examples of that? I'd be really interested in hearing.
So the biggest thing I hear that without trying to brag, nail in my podcasting is the guesting experience, because your guests are really like what propel your growth when you're on a budget. If you have the budget to spend ads on other podcasts or social media or that kind of stuff, great, you can definitely grow that way. But so many podcasters are starting up and they're like, well, how do I do this on a budget?
Right.
It's getting guests, getting right guests, getting good guests, interviewing them well, and then treating them well afterwards, so then they share your podcast. And that's really the secret sauce. And I hear it so often where people will have a guest on the show and then be disappointed that they didn't share it to their social platforms or share it to whatever they were expecting it, but there was no communication there of expectations or just value to the guest. Because if you're having a guest on the show, especially if it's somebody that's like high profile or has a lot going on, they're busy, they're probably not necessarily the listener of your show, so they're not going to know when their episode comes out. Like, you got to tell them, and you don't always put that together. So that was the main thing. And I kind of have a framework that I use for guests. If that's something that you want me to share, I can kind of walk through that A to Z
Sure.
with you.
Sure.
So the first thing, it starts with getting the guest. And I think there's a community around podcasting right now that it's so easy to get a guest. And when I say easy, I mean you have to put in work to it, but it's a flattering request and it doesn't take too much time. Like, to have somebody come speak at your live event, that's a big ask, because they have to fly in and room and board overnight away from their family, all that kind of stuff. A 30-minute podcast, an hour-long podcast, like, it's only an hour of their day, and they don't have to prepare for it. They show up and you ask them questions and you get their knowledge and you go on with their day. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, because I think there's a lot of people that are afraid of asking for the guests. And then when you're asking, the framework that I use is first you tell them why you thought of them. So why are you following them? Why are you reaching out? Butter them up a little bit, if you will. Not to the point where like they know that you're just cheesing out and nothing about them, but put some real thought into it there, and then tell them a little bit about your audience, because they want to know that your audience is going to be the right audience for them growing their brand and stuff. It doesn't really make sense for a businessman like Mark Cuban, say, to come on a all about your pet podcast. There's a disconnect there. Even if there's a ton of listeners, they're probably not in the entrepreneur space where he would want to stay. So you got to think of that as well. But then once you get like who your audience is, you always use the verbiage, I want to feature you, or I want to promote you on my podcast, not can you be a guest on my podcast, because the words feature and promote, those add value to your guest. So you want to keep that in mind. And then at the bottom, I always put in who I've had prior or who I have coming up as guests. And it doesn't have to be in order. I would just put your most notable guests. And that way, they're like, okay, well, you've had Mark Cuban, like, I want to be a part of that, or, then as you get more and more prestigious guests, then it's easier and easier to get more and more prestigious guests. So that's kind of the framework that I use to reach out. Then the next thing you got to do is obviously nail the interview. Because if they have a bad experience in the interview, like, they're not going to share it anyways, no matter how much you ask or what you provide them, because they don't think it's value. So be like, if they are somebody that gets interviewed a lot, be prepared to ask unique questions and do some digging, like learn what they get to talk about all the time. And that's something that like is just going to be another interview for them. But if you can put your own spin on it, then you're going to bring them a better experience. Or if you're listening to past interviews that they've done and they get really excited about a topic, those are some topics that you'll want to ask them, because that's what they're really passionate about in that. So then when you get done with the interview, the follow-up is key. because again, I touched on this before, but they're not going to be stalking your podcast to see when their episode comes out, to, you know, search for the link, create a photo, and then share it to their social platforms. You want to do all that work for them. So you could do like a week in advance and then the day of, but definitely have the day of your podcast launches or releases that you send them an email, and in that email, again, thank them for being a part of your podcast and all that kind of stuff, you know, remind them of how good it was, and then give them a link to your episode page. I always make a guest profile for them on my website, which probably doesn't get a whole ton of like traffic, but it makes them feel good that like they have their own profile on my website and stuff. And then you give them a direct download to the MP3 so they could use it in any of their marketing that they want to do. I give them an embeddable link. So if they wanted to embed our podcast on their website, they certainly can. That doesn't happen too often, so like don't expect that. But if it does, like it's just another link where people can find out about you for the first time. And then I also send some quote graphics and cover art for that episode. So episode title, my picture, their picture, and then the logo of the podcast or your business or whatever on that, and send that to them, and then leave it as, here's some assets I created. I'll be sharing them at this and this time. Feel free to use as much or as little as you want. You don't want to ever say like, you must share at least 3 things, because then that's being too forceful. But if you're providing them all the work literally for them, like the odds of them sharing go up 1,000% rather than them trying to track you down and do that. Even that, what I just shared is way better than saying, hey, the episode went live today. You have to make it super easy and like just dumb of them not to share it because it's right there in front of them.
Right. That's really good tips there. Yeah.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Have you ever had somebody on your podcast that hasn't gone so well, and it's one that you don't really want to air because of it? And if you have, how do you deal with that?
In the moment, yeah. So I've had an interview that I was like, man, and I think it was more because I interviewed him on video, but it's an audio, obviously only podcast, and he was just kind of like unanimated while we were talking, and I was like, man, this guy is dull. I'm not gonna tell who he is or she, but I was like, I don't even know if I can air this thing. But then I was listening it back in my editing software, and I realized that in the audio only format, like it was still really good content. So I did end up releasing that and stuff. But at the end of the day, like you can't judge your own content too much. Like let other people judge it for you, right? Because you might that podcast or that whatever you might think is like bad, somebody else might be a light bulb for them, just how it was phrased or that kind of stuff. So if it is something that you're like, man, I don't know if I want that as an episode on my podcast, maybe just release it as like a bonus episode and see how it goes, and then keep your regular flow. But I don't think it's gonna like hurt your brand or if it's one bad episode out of 50 or 100 or what have you. Now if you're a podcast that's like really clean and they're cussing up a storm or whatever, then obviously if it's something that's against your brand or against your identity, then there's some consideration to not share it. But if you've put in the work of doing the podcast, I'd share it more often than not.
Thank you.
Yeah. That we've had one that was kind of hard to get through, just trying to make it to, 30 minutes, because it was pretty brutal, but
Yeah.
we were kind of concerned about, man, do we really want to do this? But we told
Well,
them we
hopefully
would.
you're not thinking that now.
No. No,
I do have 2 podcast stations, so they go up anyway. So no names stated, but there was one on the other podcast. But we did the same. I sent it out everywhere, but it was just on a different station. That's all.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, do you have any advice for someone that's thinking about starting a podcast?
Yeah, plenty. I think the biggest piece of advice, and when somebody comes to me asking advice for podcasting, typically it's around how do I start, but more often than that, it's deeper of like, I'm afraid of starting. And that's kind of the root of it, because like podcasting is not really that difficult to figure out as far as a tech standpoint. I mean, I'm sitting here with a pair of headphones, a $50 mic. I don't even need the mic to start. I started with just these headphones here and like that, and then Zoom, and that's all you need. And then podcasting hosts. But the fear of starting is a real roadblock for people, because they don't like the sound of their voice. They're not confident that they are, the subject matter expert. I started a podcast called the Science of Sports Recovery podcast. I knew about this much of sports recovery. Like I had a degree in exercise science, so I knew what the body was, but how to like recover better than say the average Joe, I had no idea. But I know a lot more now because I get to interview all the experts and that kind of stuff. So my advice would just be start. And when I say start, I mean start without expectations, because that is what's holding you back. If you expect, I'm going to have 100 downloads in the first episode, or 50,000 in the first 3 months, that those expectations, then when you don't hit it, or if you don't hit it, start to discourage you. Where if you say, I'm going to just start this, learn the skill, right? Learn the podcasting skill for the first 3 months, and then we'll go from there. Like that is the best way to start. And then you're 3 months in and you look up kind of from your day to day and you go, okay, now I'm here. Whether that's I get 5 episode listens, a week, or it's I get 500 a week, wherever you are, then you're like, okay, now how do I improve on this from here? And so that would be my biggest advice, is just to start. And then the other thing is, there's so many more ways to make money from a podcast than just sponsor ads. And I think when people are starting a podcast, whether they have a business or not, that's how they think they're going to monetize it. Because at the end of the day, like podcasting is fun, but it is a lot of work as well. So to keep it long term, you need to make money from it somehow. Otherwise it becomes a lot of work, and that's where you see podcasts coming down a lot. So, but there's a lot of different ways to monetize besides just sponsored ads. So being creative on that and really chatting with somebody about that would be my advice on as far as monetization goes.
I would think too. I mean, we noticed, Roy and I, we started last year around this time, and we've had our ups and downs. It's like a business. You've got your seasons where there's more listeners, there's less listeners. We've got our seasons where there's more people who are wanting to be on podcasts. I mean, January was really quiet. I mean, in all fairness too, I didn't reach out as much, but it was also, and you have to keep reaching out. But it is, there are the ups and downs, and just like anything. And that's one thing, not to get discouraged. Like you're saying, you're here, but if you're up here and it goes down a little bit, don't get discouraged. There's the ups and downs month to month. So,
yeah. Well, as a little backstory, Roy and I were in a group, and so and we were trying to get topics. So I said, well, what about podcasting? That seems popular. So I did a bunch of research and I made these presentations on podcasts, equipment, platforms, all these different things. It was about like a 5-week, one day a week, 5 weeks. And so Lori Ann, she was all excited and she goes, I want to do it. I want to do podcasting. So she's in the background doing research on her own.
Yeah.
And she get through, she goes, let's do a podcast. I'm like, really? We don't know anything about podcasting. We'll figure it out. Let's do it. So that's how we interviewed each other. I guess how we started out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I really wanted to back in, I guess it was 2019. It was 2019 around in the July time. I guess it was around July that I really was starting to get an interest in it. So it took almost a year before I actually got on. But I was glad to find Roy because it's a lot more fun doing it with someone else, really.
Yeah, it keeps you accountable too.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a lot of people like you, they go, how'd you get into podcasting? I said, I stumbled into it basically,
Yeah.
And they always say, well, I couldn't do that. I don't like the sound of my voice. I don't want to be on camera. I said, it's not that big a deal. You're making it way more than it is.
Yeah. I was literally talking to somebody today about the sound of your voice in podcasting. And that was like the thing that was holding her back. And I said, like, it's just because you're used to hearing yourself through your cheekbone and not out loud. Once you edit yourself enough episodes and it's just like another person. So it's like, you wouldn't make fun of somebody else's voice, so why like judge your own? Your voice is your voice. Obviously there are some things that you can do to improve, tonality and that kind of stuff. But I mean, you were gifted a voice and use it.
Well, it's interesting you say that because I was in a deal where it was like a sales training deal, and people saying, well, I don't my voice. And so the guy says, okay, so say something to me. So they're talking. He's okay. He says, you know how your voice sounds right now? Yeah, that's the way it sounds to everybody that hears you. It's the same voice.
Yeah.
Everybody else hears it. It's the same. So why be afraid of it?
Mm-hmm.
It's exactly the same voice.
Yeah. Unless if you've been beaten down your whole life with your voice sucks, it's like if nobody said anything about it this far, nobody's going to say about it. And,
Yeah.
So
exactly. I mean,
it's so true.
I always tell people it's just a conversation.
Yeah.
Except, maybe like we're doing Zoom, it's a conversation. That's all it is.
As you think about it, if you really didn't like your voice so much, you probably wouldn't speak to anybody, not even your friends.
Yeah.
If your friends listen to you, so will the people out there.
Yeah.
That's interesting. We're so self-conscious, aren't we? We're all self-conscious about something.
Yeah, we judge ourselves way too much. I mean, at the end of the day, that's kind of the gist of it. And that's why a lot of people don't start or don't keep with it, is because they're too busy judging themselves.
Yeah. Just do it. Just do it.
Yeah.
Learn as you go, right?
And now we're sponsored by Nike.
I was just going to say. Well, that's the other thing too, speaking of which, I'm sure, Jase, that you've noticed that the platforms too for podcasts make it super easy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and they, easily spread it out to all the different, podcast stations out there with just a button push.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I think like the hardest decision in podcasting tech stack is who you go with as a host, because that is something that if you decide to switch later, like some of your stats don't carry over. So like if you're going to do, like, don't do too much research into a microphone or into Zoom, like just do that. But if you're going to do any research, put it into the podcasting host. But keep in mind, don't be paralyzed by your research, because they're all easy to use. Some have advantages over others just on what stats they provide and that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, like, they all distribute your podcast the same. You're not going to get more listens if you have Buzzsprout over Captivate over Anchor. So the important metric isn't going to change. It's just going to be, what do you like the best? So I've chosen personally to go with Captivate.fm to host my podcast, just because I can host multiple podcasts for one price instead of having to pay for multiple podcasting RSS feeds or whatever. And they make it really easy, and I like the layout of their stats. So
I mean, when I was doing research, I just basically did a spreadsheet. Podbeam, this, and this. Buzzsprout, this, and this. I mean, I just Captivate, there was about 8 or 9 of them I did. I just put a spreadsheet together and said, well, the price, this is the best. Combined all together, I think this would be the one, but all of them will work for you, right?
Yeah. Who'd you guys go with?
Yeah, but it was interesting, at the difference and the similarities.
Yeah.
At the same time.
And then I went on to each and every one of them and tried each and every one of them, and I thought, what, we're just beginners. Let's just go with it. And we're with Buzzsprout. I have no complaints at all. There we go. We're putting a little, plug on that too. So
yeah, Buzzsprout's a good company. And I know they have some cool features now that they didn't have when I started. I was like, oh, that'd be cool. But
yeah, they even just added the intro extra option too. So
yeah,
that's
dynamic content.
Just gonna try.
I'm a little jealous, I'll be honest.
Sometimes when you start with the slower one, they end up passing forward. So
well,
but no, we've no complaints. But yeah, that's fine. I think that's another thing too, though, that really intimidates people, and it did a little bit with me, was even finding that. And then I thought, why was I intimidated? It's like so easy.
Yeah. And if you are out there and you're at this point where you're like, I can't make a decision between this or this, just honestly get with somebody you trust that's podcasting and just go with whatever they did. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter that much. It's far more important what you put in your podcast than how it gets distributed.
Yeah.
Well,
so Jase, how can our listeners reach out to you?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn at Jase Kraft, JaseKraft. Otherwise, you can go to my website, perfectmypodcast.com. And if you want to see kind of what I'm doing on the athletic side and science of sports recovery, I post all that stuff on Instagram at JCheese, JaeCheese. It's a play on my last name because Kraft cheese.
I love it.
Yeah.
Now, I know that you have events. Did you want to share any events that are coming up?
Yeah. So if you're interested in podcasting yourself, I have 2 events a month for podcasters that honestly, we bring in somebody from the group to talk about a certain subject about podcasting, whether it be better interviewing skills, social media for podcasting, breaking through some of the roadblocks, getting on other people's podcasts, all those kinds of things. That's at, you can find the details for that in the Facebook group, Podcasters Connection. And then the other event that I'm hosting here upcoming in April is going to be the Podcasters Growth Summit. So we're going to have 12 to 18 speakers on a weekend there, with a bunch of good and expert speakers. I can't release all their names yet because not everything is finalized, but I do know we do have the one of the top 10 podcast hosts in UK business category. She is a voice coach herself, so she's going to talk to us about how to use your voice in a way that's pleasing to the audience. So if you are one that is like self-conscious about your voice, you'll have to come and listen to her.
Excellent. And where would they find that one? Is that that's on the Podcasters Group Summit? Is that on the Facebook as well, or?
Yeah, if you join the group, I'm posting more about it there. It'll have its own website here shortly. I just don't have that made yet. So the best place would probably be going to the Facebook group, Podcasters Connection. Otherwise, you can always shoot me an email if you want to be know when that's coming out. It's Jase@perfectmypodcast.com.
Okay.
Perfect.
Cool. We really appreciate you taking your time, Jase, with us today. Learned a lot, actually.
Well, good. That's what I'm here for.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks for reaching out to me. I really love that. And I do find that the podcast community, they're fantastic. They're really a bunch of positive people. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. If you are talking to a podcaster, it's not going to be a dull conversation because they can talk.
Exactly. Again, thanks a lot. And we will be having this up shortly. So for the listeners, thank you for listening, and have a wonderful day.
Jase, it was great to meet you.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Okay. Thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Be sure to visit us at liftyourstory.com.